The sun had not yet fully risen, but the air was already heavy, humid, and suffocating. The first lights of the morning barely managed to pierce through the mist, mixed with the dust, stirred up by the slow steps of hundreds of bare feet. Men, women, and even children were awakened not by the song of birds or the smell of coffee, but by the sharp crack of a whip slicing through the air, a warning that the day had begun and that no delay would be tolerated. It did not matter if the previous night had been full of rain or intense cold. The work awaited, and the body had no right to rest. The plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, with fields of sugarcane, coffee, or cotton that seemed endless. At its center, the big house oversaw everything, built atop a small hill like the throne of a cruel king. From it came curt orders passed to the overseers, who in turn transmitted them through shouts and blows. It was a simple but relentless chain of command. Those at the top decided, those in the middle punished, and those at the bottom suffered. And at the bottom, always, were the enslaved black people. The conditions were brutal. The workday began before sunrise and only ended long after the sun had set. Calloused hands bled from constant effort. Cracked feet encountered thorns and stones along the way, and the entire body bent under the weight of loads seemingly designed to break any human spine. Food was minimal. A mix of flour, beans, and at best, a piece of salted meat that barely sustained the energy needed for a few more hours of labor. The midday heat turned the field into a real furnace. Sweat ran like rivers, mixing with dust to create a layer of grime that clung to the skin. The air was heavy, and each breath seemed to steal more energy than it gave. But stopping to rest was not an option. The eyes of the foreman were always watching, looking for any sign of weakness that could serve as justification for punishment. This perverse logic had a clear purpose: fear. It was not enough to work. One had to work as if one's very life depended on it, because, in truth, it did. Yet there was something even more cruel. In many cases, even when all the work was done perfectly, the whipping still came. This created a constant sense of insecurity, as if any wrong, or even right, move could lead to suffering. Cries of pain were a common sound, almost trivialized. For the younger ones, newly brought from other lands, the first week was a brutal shock. The older ones, on the other hand, had already learned to harden their faces and show no reaction, not because the pain was less, but because they knew that showing suffering could be seen as weakness, and in the master's logic, weakness deserved even more punishment. Control was not only physical, it was psychological. The certainty that any effort could be in vain created a kind of mental prison. And it was in this suffocating environment of limitless work and punishments without apparent reason that our story unfolds. A world where sweat was never enough, where human dignity was crushed day after day, and where life could be lost not only from overwork, but from the brutality of a whip that knew no mercy. There was a perverse detail in the logic of slavery. No matter how much the enslaved person worked, there was no guarantee they would be spared punishment. Many believed, upon arriving at the plantation, that simply following orders would avoid the master's wrath. This illusion was quickly destroyed. A single sideways glance, an overseer in a bad mood, or simply the desire to set an example was enough for the whipping to be ordered. It was not about discipline, it was about keeping alive the sense that at any moment, without apparent reason, pain could fall upon anyone. It was common to see someone work the entire day without rest, and still at the end of the afternoon be called to the center of the yard. There, in front of everyone, the body was tied to a log or post. Nothing was said, no reason was given. The silence before the first strike was more cruel than the whip's own sound. The others watched, powerless, knowing there was no logic to follow to avoid that fate. The message was clear. You are not in control of your life. This exemplary punishment had a devastating effect. With each public whipping, hope diminished a little more. The master's goal was simple: break the spirit before breaking the body. Upon seeing a companion punished without cause, each worker understood that working well was not enough. One had to live in constant alert, as if every breath could be judged. This state of permanent tension corroded the mind, making fear part of the routine. And there were days when the work, no matter how intense, simply did not meet the overseer's expectations. Perhaps production had been lower because of unbearable heat, or because rain had made harvesting difficult. But for the master, these were unacceptable excuses. The blame always fell on the enslaved, and as punishment, not only was the whipping applied, but it was carried out in a prolonged and cruel manner so that all others could see and understand the lesson. There was also the cruelty of forced competition. The masters, to increase productivity, compared one to another as if they were animals in a contest. Whoever harvested less, carried less weight, or finished last, all became targets. This practice divided and isolated, creating distrust among the enslaved themselves, who feared being accused of working too little if they helped a slower companion. The worst was when the victim of the punishment was someone known for their dedication and strength. On such occasions, the injustice was so evident that the shock ran through the entire group. After all, if not even the most dedicated was safe, what remained for the others? It was at this point that the system achieved its ultimate goal, destroying any idea of merit or security. Life became a sequence of identical days in which the only certainty was uncertainty. This practice, repeated day after day, left deep marks, not only scars on the body but invisible wounds on the soul. Many carried for life the trauma of seeing friends and family punished without cause. Others, to endure the pain, learned to numb their feelings, becoming almost insensitive. But even those who seemed not to react felt the revolt growing inside, silently feeding the desire for freedom. It was this environment of fear and arbitrariness that set the stage for what was to come. Because if the whipping could come even when the work was perfect, there were also those moments when the intention was not only to punish, but to destroy. And when that decision was made, the punished person's fate was rarely survival. The whip was not just a gesture of violence, it was a machine carefully designed to extract the maximum pain and submission. Each instrument had a purpose, each blow was calculated, and each session was carried out in a way that would leave not only the body, but also the mind marked forever. The masters knew that physical pain heals, but the humiliation and terror engraved in memory remain alive for years, and that was exactly what they wanted. The most common instrument was the rawhide whip, with long, thick strips, often soaked in salt to increase the burning sensation. Some versions had metal tips or sharp bones designed to tear the skin with each strike. Others used the so-called three-tailed whip, known for multiplying the impact and spreading wounds over larger areas of the body. The mere sound of the leather cutting through the air was enough to silence an entire group, for all knew that in moments the scream would come. But the cruelty was not only in the instrument, it was in the way the punishment was applied. The enslaved person was tied to a wooden log or a tall post, with arms raised so that the back was completely exposed. The stretched skin made each blow more penetrating. In some cases, the victim was laid over a barrel or bench, with hands and feet bound, preventing any defensive movement. It was a position of total vulnerability, designed so the punisher had absolute control. The overseers, trained for this work, knew how to measure their strength to prolong the suffering. It was not about delivering blind blows, but about striking muscles, tendons, and nerves in sequence, alternating regions so that the pain spread throughout the entire body. It was a macabre choreography, performed before a forced audience. The goal was twofold: to punish the victim and to feed fear in those who watched. The human body, faced with such violence, reacted in various ways. In the first blows, the skin opened in fine lines from which hot blood flowed. As minutes passed, these lines became deep gashes, exposing layers of muscle. The salt from sweat mixed with dirt and, in some cases with salt intentionally applied to the wounds, turned each breath into hell. The pain was not confined to the back. It radiated through the arms, neck and spine, making any movement impossible without suffering. Some enslaved people, after the punishment, were left tied under the scorching sun so the heat would worsen the wounds. Others were thrown to the ground without care, forced to return to work the next day, even with their backs raw and bleeding. There were reports of people fainting during the whipping, only to be revived with cold water and forced to continue receiving blows, because, for the masters, an interrupted punishment did not fulfill its exemplary role. In addition to the whip, there were other instruments of torture. Chains with rings that dug into wrists and ankles, preventing movement and causing wounds that easily became infected. Iron collars with inward-pointing spikes that injured the neck at the slightest abrupt movement. Even stocks with openings to trap hands and feet were used, forcing the victim to remain for hours in a painful position under sun or rain as a form of psychological punishment. The terror was intensified by the ritual preceding the punishment. Many times, the overseer would walk slowly toward the whipping post with the whip coiled in his hand, unraveling it loop by loop in front of everyone. This seemingly simple gesture created unbearable tension. The victim knew that each second of waiting was another blow to the mind, even before feeling the first pain in the body. And there was also a perverse element. Some masters ordered other enslaved people to carry out the punishment, forcing them to harm co-workers and even family members. This practice destroyed bonds of trust and created internal divisions, ensuring that collective resistance became increasingly difficult. Those who refused to comply with this order, in turn, became the next victim. It was in this setting that the whipping ceased to be merely an act of punishment and became a spectacle of total domination. There was no escape, no defense, no negotiation. And in certain cases, there was no return, because there were moments when the intention was not only to scar, but to kill. And when that decision was made, the whipping became a one-way path for the victim. There was a dark and silent moment when everyone realized that this punishment would not end with the victim returning home. No one needed to say anything. It was enough to look at the overseer's face, at the cold gleam in the master's eyes, and all knew this was a whipping meant to leave no survivors. It was an execution disguised as punishment. The first blows, as always, were quick and hard. But what set this type of session apart was the absence of pauses, the increasing intensity, and the complete indifference to the signs that the body could no longer endure. The back split open into deep wounds, the skin tore away in pieces, and the flesh began to show. Blood ran in thick streams, forming puddles on the hard-packed ground. The air filled with the metallic smell of blood mixed with sweat and dust, creating a suffocating atmosphere. As the minutes passed, the victim's breathing became irregular, broken by faint moans or by screams that echoed through the yard. But in some cases, even these sounds disappeared, replaced by a silence that only heightened the cruelty of the scene. The overseer continued, blow after blow, as if breaking an object and not punishing a human being. It was common for the whipping to be carried out in front of all the other enslaved people as a spectacle of warning. They were forced to watch, even if they wanted to look away. Some cried silently, others, already hardened by years of violence, kept an impassive face but felt their stomachs churn inside. The goal was not only to kill the punished one, it was also to kill the hope of those who remained. There were reports of victims who, even unconscious, were tied upright so that the body remained in the proper position for the whipping. On these occasions, the overseer needed two other enslaved people to hold the victim, preventing them from falling. When the body finally collapsed, without strength and without life, still a few more blows were given, as if death were only a detail in the process. Some punishments were deliberately prolonged, not only by the force of the blows, but by the cruelty of alternating areas of the body, ensuring that the pain was spread evenly. The back, the legs, the arms, no part was safe. And when the skin no longer offered resistance, each new blow struck muscles and even bones, tearing out hoarse screams that seemed to come from the depths of the soul. The most brutal cases often had trivial origins: a harvest below the target, a look considered disrespectful, or even an attempt to protect another workmate. At other times, death was the result of a master's personal revenge against an enslaved person who dared to question an order. There was no process, no defense, no justice, only the silent sentence that the person would not live to see the next day. When the whipping ended, the lifeless body was hurriedly removed, often buried in shallow graves on the edges of the plantation. There were no rituals, no dignified farewells. It was as if that person had never existed. But in the memory of those who witnessed it, the scene remained engraved with disturbing clarity. Many carried for years the trauma of hearing the sound of the blows echoing at night, as if the whip still cut through the air long after the victim's death. The most perverse thing was that, for the masters, this type of punishment was not a failure, but a demonstration of power. Death served as the final message that the life of an enslaved person had value only as long as it was useful for work. When it no longer served, or when it was necessary to reaffirm control, the end came quickly, but not without first passing through the ritual of extreme pain. And so, each whipping to death became a shadow that hung over the entire enslaved community. A silent threat that said, "Your effort will never be enough, and if I wish, your life ends here." It was this certainty that kept fear alive, and it was this fear that sustained a system built to crush not only bodies, but the very essence of the human being. The whipping, even when it led to death, was rarely questioned. There was no investigation, no court, no voice for those who fell. The system of slavery was sustained not only by physical force, but by a silent pact between masters, overseers, and authorities, all willing to ignore cruelty in the name of profit and order. The law, when it existed, was made to protect property, not life. And in that context, the enslaved person was not seen as a human being, but as a possession that could be used, punished, and even destroyed without legal consequences for the owner. Even in regions where minimal rules about punishments existed, they were treated as mere formalities, easily bypassed with false witnesses or simple omission. The overseers knew they were protected. An overseer could kill an enslaved person in front of dozens of witnesses and still face no trial. If anyone dared to report what had happened, retaliation was immediate. This was the first pillar of the law of silence. Fear. The fear that speaking would mean being the next to feel the whip. The second pillar was forced complicity. Many times, other enslaved people were forced to take part in the punishment, holding the victim, preparing the whipping post, or even delivering the blows. This created an unbearable weight on the conscience of those who obeyed, but also ensured that no one could place themselves as completely innocent in the eyes of the masters. It was a bond of collective guilt that suffocated any attempt at denunciation or rebellion. Silence was also fueled by an unbridgeable social barrier. For free white people, the pain of the enslaved was not a subject of concern. Anyone who tried to intervene was seen as an enemy of order and could suffer economic or even physical retaliation. The few voices that rose against brutality were quickly isolated, defamed, or intimidated into silence. Inside the slave quarters, speaking about a recent punishment was a dangerous act. The clay and wooden walls had ears, and any word spoken at the wrong moment could reach the overseer's ears. The result was an environment of constant surveillance, where even sadness had to be hidden. Tears were shed in the dark, and anger had to be kept deep in the soul, like a flame burning in silence. This silence was not only imposed by violence, but internalized over time. Many, in order to survive, learned to accept horror as an inevitable part of life. Pretending there was nothing to say became a way to protect the little that remained, their very existence. And so the truth about hundreds of deaths and punishments was lost, buried along with the victims. But paradoxically, the law of silence also created a secret collective memory. Even without speaking, the enslaved kept within themselves each face, each name, each scream. This memory was transmitted between the lines of the songs sung at night in whispered prayers and in the glances exchanged during work. It was a story told without words, surviving despite all efforts to erase it. The whipping to death did not end when the body fell. It continued to live like a ghost in the field, a memory haunting each worker, reminding them that it would take only an instant for it to be their turn. And this silent terror was the foundation on which the entire slave system rested. Despite the forced silence, there was something that neither the whip nor death could take away: memory. It was not recorded in books or proclaimed in speeches. It was kept in the songs, whispered at night, in the gestures repeated from generation to generation, and in the prayers made in languages the masters did not understand. It was a silent but powerful resistance that kept alive the identity of those who were treated as merchandise. At night, after the exhausting work, when darkness covered the field and the overseers had withdrawn, small groups gathered in the slave quarters. It was not only to rest, but to remember those who had gone, to remember the names that could not be spoken in front of the masters, to remember the stories that connected each one to their origins. The singing, often sad, was also a code. Each verse could carry hidden messages, a tribute to someone lost, a warning about danger, or a reminder that freedom was still possible. Hands, even wounded and calloused, continued to create. Braids, seed necklaces, drawings on the ground, everything was loaded with meaning. These elements functioned as symbols of resistance, preserving African cultural traits that the masters tried to erase. By wearing a traditional hairstyle, for example, a woman could be honoring her mother's memory or passing on a pattern that represented the village from which she came. Prayer was another pillar of this resistance. Many found strength in faith, whether in the religions they had brought from their native lands or in the mixture of them with the imposed Christianity. To pray was not only to ask for protection, but to affirm that there was something greater than the master of the plantation. It was to declare that no matter if the body was chained, the spirit remained free. In some cases, memory was preserved in an even riskier way, through stories told to children. Narratives about warriors, kings, and queens of Africa, about prosperous villages and sea voyages. These stories not only kept the cultural heritage alive, but also planted in younger minds the idea that slavery was not the natural state of things. There had been a before, and there could be an after. There were also moments of practical resistance. Small acts that on their own might seem insignificant, but together formed a shield against complete submission. Walking more slowly to save strength, hiding a bit of food for a weakened companion, discreetly teaching someone to recognize escape signs or to read a word. Each gesture of this kind was a silent affront to the system. Memory was also kept alive in farewell rituals, even if improvised. When someone died, whether from whipping, illness, or extreme exhaustion, they were not merely buried. There was always someone who, discreetly, would say a prayer, sing a verse, or leave an object with the body. It was a way of ensuring that this life would not be forgotten, even if the official history tried to erase it. This silent resistance was what prevented the law of silence from becoming a law of forgetting. While fear tried to quiet them, memory found ways to seep through. And so, generation after generation, stories and symbols crossed time, surviving the chains, the whip, and even death. Deep down, the masters knew they could not completely destroy this flame. They could control bodies, impose exhausting workdays, and even take lives, but they could not erase the memory of a free past, nor the hope of a future without chains. And it was precisely this flame, guarded and protected in silence, that would one day become the foundation for the cry of freedom. Although the chains were broken more than 1 century ago in many places, the echo of the whip still resounds, invisible in the social, economic, and cultural structures of the present. The body is no longer tied to a post, but there are still those who live chained by poverty, prejudice, and exploitation. The logic of working to exhaustion has survived, adapting to new names and formats, and many times still takes lives slowly and silently. In unhealthy factories, hidden plantations, and illegal mines, there are still people working in conditions that, in essence, recall the same system of oppression that sustained the whip. Excessive workdays, miserable wages, lack of basic rights, and constant surveillance keep thousands in a state of submission. The difference is that today, the chain is made of necessity and lack of alternatives, and the whip is replaced by the threat of hunger or dismissal. Structural racism, a direct legacy of slavery, continues to define opportunities and destinies. Many descendants of enslaved people still live in marginalized territories, with little access to quality education, adequate health care, or decent jobs. Prejudice, now more subtle, acts as an invisible barrier that keeps inequality alive, like a social scar that has never been treated. Public humiliation, once carried out in the plantation yard, can now happen on social media or in the workplace. The same strategies of emotional and psychological domination used by the masters can still be seen in abusive power relationships. The fear of speaking out, of reporting, persists, as if the law of silence had crossed time and adapted to modern rules. It is also possible to see the reflection of this past in the way certain lives are still treated as disposable. Rural workers exposed to pesticides without protection, laborers on dangerous construction sites without proper equipment, migrants exploited by unscrupulous employers, all carry, in body and mind, the weight of a system that has learned to hide cruelty behind contracts, deadlines, and quotas. But just as in the past, there is also resistance. Organizations, social movements, and individuals fight every day to break these new chains. The memory of slavery fuels these struggles, reminding us that silence only favors those who oppress. And preserving this history is essential so that it is not repeated in new forms. The whip, in the present, may not leave visible marks on the skin, but it leaves deep wounds on dignity. And that is why telling these stories is so urgent, because as long as there is exploitation, as long as there is imposed inequality, slavery will not have truly ended. It will only have changed its face. The challenge is to recognize these patterns, no matter how well disguised they are, and act to break them. This requires awareness, empathy, and courage. And it also requires that the memory of those who suffered in the past not be treated as a closed chapter, but as a constant warning for the future. Thus, in remembering those who were whipped to death, we are not only honoring their lives, we are also taking on the responsibility of not allowing new whippings, visible or invisible, to continue marking the backs and souls of so many. Now that you have walked through each part of this story, you may realize that the whip was not only an instrument of physical pain, It was a weapon to destroy hope, dignity, and the very humanity of those who lived under slavery. We are not speaking only of wounds that time healed on the skin, but of marks that cross generations and still shape the society we live in today. Every muffled cry, every body fallen in the yard, every empty gaze from those who knew they would not see the next sunrise, all of this became part of a collective memory that cannot be forgotten. And remembering these stories is not just an exercise in compassion, it is an act of resistance. It is refusing the convenient version of history that tries to soften or erase the brutality of the past. But the truth is that this violence does not belong only to history books. It survives disguised in the inequalities we see every day. It survives in the workdays that drain the last drop of a worker's energy, in the wages that barely sustain a family, in the doors closed to those born with the wrong skin color. The whip of today may not crack in the air, but it still strikes lives. And that is why this video is not only about the past, it is a warning. A call for each of us to recognize these new forms of chains and to refuse to accept them as normal. Because if we remain silent, we will be repeating the mistake of those who watched in silence in the past. If this story has touched you, share it. Make more people aware of this truth. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue together uncovering stories that time has tried to bury. And remember, to tell is to resist. And to resist is the only way to ensure there will never again be a whipping to death.